Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this virtual presentation. I'm Jim Van Epps, Program Chair for the Savannah Council and host for this evening's panel discussion entitled Russia, Ukraine, Will There Be War? It's certain to be interesting, featuring historical as well as new developments with retired Ambassador Lawrence Silverman as moderator and Professors Olavi, Arens, Jacek Lubecki, and Michael Baun as panelists. We put this panel together just before when it was still uncertain whether war was coming or not. So bear with us. We still think there's a lot of good information in here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Kreitz Auto Group as our sponsor for this program. Kreitz is a continuing platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for 2021 and 2022, and our exclusive dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans. We're very appreciative of their support of our programs. Thank you, Kreitz. Our panel this evening is a distinguished one. Our moderator, retired Ambassador Lawrence Silverman, is a recently retired member of the Foreign Service, and his last posting in the United States State Department was as United States Ambassador to Kuwait. You might remember his presentation to our council in January this year. Dr. Olavi Arens is a professor of history at the Armstrong campus of Georgia Southern University. He's a native of Estonia and is currently academic executive director of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. Dr. Jacek Lubecki is associate professor of political science and international studies at Georgia Southern. A native of Poland, Dr. Lubecki is the author of many books and articles on his area of expertise. He recently co-authored Defending Eastern Europe, the Defense Policies of New NATO and EU Member States. Dr. Michael Baun is professor and the Pizer Chair of International Relations at Valdosta State University. He's co-authored or authored many books, journal articles, and book chapters on the European Union, European politics, and transatlantic relations. They will participate in a wide-ranging debate on the probabilities of further Russian incursion and invasion of Ukraine. What does President Vladimir Putin really want? Can Europe avoid catastrophic geopolitical and disruption? Will the US suffer reputational impact? And what can the current crisis teach us about how US administrations can deal effectively with such foreign policy challenges? And now it's a pleasure to present Ambassador Silverman and our distinguished panel. Ambassador, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Jim, thanks very much. It's great to be with you and with our distinguished co-panelists here and with all of you out there listening. Many of you were probably wondering why Vladimir Putin is doing this, the invasion of Ukraine. Putin told you this yesterday or a couple of days ago, but he also told you this 15 years ago in a speech that two friends and former colleagues of mine, Ambassador Dan Fried and Ambassador Kurt Volker, recently described as the speech in which Putin told us who he was. Putin, they aptly said, rejected the post-Cold War European security architecture and was on a deliberate path to build a greater Russia, an empire where the Soviet Union once stood. Or as another friend and colleague, William Taylor, our former ambassador to Ukraine, put it, Putin will want to own or dominate or reabsorb Ukraine until he dies. There are principles, ladies and gentlemen, that I believe in regarding which the United States must take action internationally to defend. National sovereignty is one of them. And you need partners for any persuasive action or threatened action. That's perhaps the first lesson that I'm taking so far from this crisis. You know, you're familiar with the expression safety in numbers. In foreign policy, there is leverage in numbers, and foreign policy depends on leverage. The United States is most effective when it builds international coalitions. Germany's announcement halting or suspending Nord Stream 2 would not have happened, I firmly believe, without intensive US diplomacy. And I would guess that as of a month ago or so, Mr. Putin would not have expected Germany to have done this. Even if such pressure does not prevent does not prevent an invasion, as it has not deterred Putin from his actions recently. That pressure needs to be maintained throughout the crisis. We need to have as much unanimity as possible in reaction to provocations being Putin's recognition of the areas that he calls quote unquote republics, Donetsk and Luhansk, and possible Russian troop movements into areas controlled by Ukrainian authorities. We will have, hopefully, extensive US and European sanctions. And then Putin will be looking for any cracks in that unity. Sanctions, building a coalition and building support for sanctions and other moves, military or otherwise, movement of troops require very, very labor-intensive diplomacy, and that's what you've seen from the United States in recent weeks. Another lesson to be learned from this is the value of military power to support diplomacy, to provide the leverage I spoke about. New deployments of US troops, including the ones President Biden announced today, shifting US troops, helicopters, and other materiel from elsewhere in Europe to the 3 Baltic states and Poland. Increasing deployments, if we choose, can be ratcheted back down as part of any kind of diplomatic solution or de-escalation. But we need the flexibility of being able to move military deployments around the world and credible military forces. Sanctions, of course, are another important foreign policy tool. Not the entire toolbox, but one tool, even if their efficacy is uneven at best. And generally, the effects of sanctions develop only over a longer period of time. The toolbox, as I said, must be larger. It should include military and economic assistance to those threatened as appropriate. The more broadly imposed and more carefully targeted the sanctions are on certain people and corporations, the greater the likelihood of eventual leverage. But I emphasis on the word eventual. Using sanctions is not pushing a button and getting an immediate result. You've seen the new sanctions imposed by the US today, the ban on Russia seeking sovereign loans in the United States. That won't stop a Russian intention to seek such loans now, as Moscow has been stockpiling foreign exchange, I think in part to prepare for an invasion of Ukraine. But it's a clear signal from us and others for the future. It's about raising economic costs, including borrowing costs for Moscow over time, and affecting its financial reputation. The long-term economic future of Russia is not a particularly bright one, and we can use sustained sanctions to make it less bright. The more focused on Putin and on the oligarchs, on the Duma, on Federation Council members in Russia, the better. We need to make it much more difficult for oligarchs to hide their wealth overseas through real estate and financial investments. Visa restrictions can also help make the point, reinforcing a kind of international pariah status on the political and economic leadership and elites. European countries could announce new efforts to root out these financial ties and seek to end them. And of course, new sanctions could include export controls. We'll see whether they eventually involve Russia's highly concentrated financial sector's access to the SWIFT system. Remember, however, sanctions cut both ways. In the Ukraine case, they could lead, true, to higher energy prices. Not the sanctions themselves, but the retaliation that Russia might engage in. They could lead to higher energy prices and increase inflation a bit. In the United States, less so than Europe. But we need to be prepared for that in order to maximize the leverage that we have. True, Europe gets 40% of its energy needs from Russia and its gas, but the energy sector for Russia accounts for 15% of its GDP and over 1/3 of the Russian budget and more than half of its export revenues. So if you have moves for Moscow to deny gas to Europe, for example, in punishment, that will harm Russia's long-term reputation as a global supplier. And it can encourage further Europe to further try to lessen its dependence on Russia, Russian gas, particularly over time. You'll remember that there were a lot of talking after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Europe needed to cut down its dependence. It did not do that. It did not learn that lesson, but maybe it will. We need a very adept public messaging, including selective releases of declassified intelligence. And you've seen that to an unusual degree this time by the Biden administration. And it's used as a tactic to deter and also to expose what we consider and what really is disinformation, to get out ahead of that false narrative. One of the biggest lessons is to show that your resolve is long-term. You're in this for the long haul, because your opponents almost always are. And that's just not, in this case, it's not just the object being Russia, but in many other cases. So, and if you notice that the military assistance that we've been giving not only to Ukraine, but also to allies, and now the allies have been giving those allies have been giving military assistance to Ukraine. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. And fundamental economic assistance can be another. You saw that we recently, I think you may have heard that we offered a $1 billion loan guarantee to Ukraine. And it's important because of the economic pressure Russia will place upon Ukraine. We need consistent strengthening, not talking about enlargement, but considered strengthening of NATO. We have to be prepared for an extended campaign by Russia to weaken or destabilize Ukraine politically and economically, as well as militarily, through cyber attacks, not just against Ukraine, but potentially here as well. We need bipartisan congressional support back here in the United States. And lastly, we need to keep providing the target of our diplomacy and target of any other actions that we take, a diplomatic path back from the precipice. You've heard this phrase, the off-ramp. And in the Ukraine case, if the invasion is eventually halted, Putin could plausibly claim that he got more of a hearing of Russia's security concerns, and that there were potentially changes in security arrangements in Europe. But that's okay for both the United States and Europe if skillfully negotiated. There are things that we've won and haven't been able to do because Russia has not been abiding by different agreements like intermediate nuclear forces, like the Budapest memorandum we can get into that kind of guarantees, was supposed to have guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine and also Belarus and Kazakhstan. But there are things that we can do, greater transparency and information sharing, that would be fine. And the G7 nations, all the major economic powers suggested that off-ramp for Putin just a few days ago. And let me just read what they said and end with that. We underline our commitment vis-a-vis Russia to pursue dialogue on issues of mutual concern, such as European security, risk reduction, transparency, confidence building, and arms control. And that remains despite the Russian military incursion into Donetsk and Luhansk. Bottom line, diplomacy doesn't end. As you know, Secretary Blinken said made sense not to go ahead with his planned meeting with the Russian foreign minister on Thursday, but he left the door open should circumstances change. Let me stop there. We'll come back. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions, but let me turn it over to Olavi right now to provide us some historical context for this crisis. Olavi?
Larry,
Yes.
before you do so, I should have indicated this earlier, but for everyone who is watching, if you have questions, please send them as soon as you formulate them through the Q&A function. And then at the end of this, I will field them and pass them back out. Okay. Thanks very much. And it's back to Olavi.
Yes, I am the historian in this group. Last summer, Vladimir Putin published an interesting essay entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And in it, he had certain phrases, I think, that have been in most reports and newspaper stories recently. He declared Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. And as you go on, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus. Incidentally, if anyone would like a copy of this article by Putin, if you email me, Arens at georgiasouthern.edu, I will send you a copy. It's about 20 pages in length. Well, you're looking at a map of Kievan Rus. This is the ancient Rus that Putin was talking about. It is the first political entity in this area. It was actually established in the 19th century by Scandinavian Varangians. So the ruling house of the Kievan Rus Principality, Maruerite, comes from Scandinavia. But we're talking about an Eastern Slavic population. Kiev is on the Dnieper River, and the Dnieper River flows into the Black Sea, and that, of course, provides access to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And the Varangians were using the river routes of Eastern Europe in order to reach the Black Sea and Constantinople, largely for trade purposes, actually. In the 10th century, Prince Vladimir, and here I'm using the Russian variant, was baptized, returned to Constantinople in 989, and in the following year, he marched the population of Kiev down to the river where they would be also baptized. This marks then the coming of Christianity to this entity, Kievan Rus, and it comes from Constantinople. It is Eastern Christianity, it is Eastern Orthodoxy. You could say, well, you know, officially the break had not occurred at that time, but it's still, I would say, you know, Eastern Orthodoxy. Well, what did this mean? It meant that the principality received an alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet, named after Saint Cyril. It is based on the Greek alphabet. It received a liturgical language for church services, Old Church Slavonic, translated the liturgy from Greek into Old Church Slavonic, plus all types of religious books from Greek to Old Church Slavonic. And other cultural elements that went along with it. The Byzantine style of painting, Byzantine architecture, the monasticism, it's a patterned on the Greek monasticism, etc., etc. This is the heritage of all of the Eastern Slavs. Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian used the Cyrillic alphabet to write. So this goes back more than 1,000 years. And there is that common heritage, which of course is disputed, right? Is it Ukrainian? Is it Russian, etc.? We get to 1240, and we have the Mongol conquest of most of this area. Kiev is sacked, and the entities, the state entity, loses its independence. What survived among the population was the culture, the religion, the languages, and including the dynasty, the Maruerite dynasty. Now, eventually, Moscow, which was on the periphery of this Kievan Rus state, emerged in the northeast of what would have been Kievan Rus, and by 1480 had become fully independent, declared its independence from the Golden Horde. This is Ivan III. At the same time, the area of what is now Ukraine and Belarus shifted westward in its orientation and came to be associated, first of all, with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And then this is a map that is post Treaty of Lublin, 1569. And what you see is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The pink areas represent the Lithuanian part of this Commonwealth. Right in the middle of that pink area is Minsk, which today is the capital of Belarus. The yellow areas represent the Polish part. So the Treaty of Lublin separated the Belarus from Ukraine. So Ukraine, Kiev is on the map, if you perhaps can see it, and it is the southeastern part, right, of this Polish entity. Now, someone like Putin would look at this map and say, aha, you see, there is no Ukraine. As a historian, I would say, but there is a rich cultural history that goes along with this, including associations, etc., with the Reformation that is going on in Europe at the time. There is social history, and there is also actually some political history during this time also that occurs. All right, fine. Gradually, the green area, of course, this represents Muscovite Russia, now centered with Moscow as the capital, which is hidden by the the information on the colors on the map. Gradually, we see Muscovy moving westward. Initially, what is now eastern Ukraine is absorbed into the Muscovite state. And then, of course, at the end of the 18th century, we have the Polish partitions. And in the course of the Polish partitions, most of Ukraine, not all, and Belarus is absorbed into the Tsarist Russian Empire. This is at the end of the 18th century. There are 3 partitions. Now, I'm going to move along quickly to the revolution of 1917. Right? We have a world war, and of course, order in Russia breaks down in the midst of this war. There is a revolution in 1917. First of all, a February Revolution, and the February Revolution meant the end of Tsarism. It opened the political, so it meant politically now a lot could be redefined, and it provided opportunities for non-Russian nationalities like the Ukrainians to begin to voice their demands. Ukrainian intellectuals, leaders of social organizations, came together in a Ukrainian Rada in Kiev and set their goal as Ukrainian autonomy in a federal Russia, and basically maintained that orientation right through 1917. The largest political party in Ukraine during this period, the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionary Party, a non-Marxist party, had this as its goal, autonomy in a federal Russia. Bolshevism was weaker in the Ukraine than in Russia proper. Hence, when the Bolshevik coup in October occurred, and the Bolsheviks assumed power in Petrograd. This was not the case in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Rada stuck to its demands for autonomy. And in fact, in December of 1917, issued a declaration of independence. And what you see in that gray area, I mean, that is roughly then Ukraine, with the borders, of course, are slightly different from today. Shortly after, this Ukraine signed a peace treaty with Germany and Central Powers at Brest-Litovsk. It gained recognition, actually, from the Central Powers. And a German military force moved in 1918. But as we know, Germany lost the war, and with the defeat, the German military retreated rather quickly from Ukraine, and what followed was a struggle for power that lasted right through 1920. The Ukrainian Rada and the Ukrainian nationalists attempted to set up an independent Ukraine. They failed. Unlike what happened in the surrounding area, because in the surrounding area, Finland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which you see on the map, and Poland obtained their independence by 1920, 1921, recognized by the other powers. Instead, Ukraine became a member of the new entity, the USSR, one of the four founding socialist republics in 1922 in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. How did this work? Well, administrative federation, cultural autonomy in the 1920s, and a centralized Communist Party control of the entire state. So actual politics was very centralized throughout the Soviet period. There is a major tragic occurrence in the 30s in Ukrainian historiography. This is termed the Holodomor, the Great Hunger. In the course of this, about 4 million Ukrainians starved to death, 1932-33. This was during the collectivization period. Ukrainian historians feel that yes, there would have been some loss of life as a result of the collectivization, but Stalin, who had a kind of special animus against Ukrainians, he curtailed Ukrainian cultural freedoms during this period. Arrests of Ukrainian administrative and Communist Party leadership occurred during this period, and the charge is that Ukraine was at the receiving end of special horrific treatment by Stalin during this period. I will end with the and this event is deeply etched in Ukrainian historical memory, Holodomor. I will end with just a few remarks on World War II, which is complicated, and we do not have time to cover it. The estimate is from 6 to 8 million Ukrainian, 6 to 8 million Ukrainian deaths in the course of the Second World War. The Holocaust hit Ukraine. Approximately 1 million Jewish inhabitants of Ukraine killed in the Second World War. This is 1/6 of the Holocaust deaths, and we have the special tragic place, Babi Yar, which is just outside of Kiev, where 34,000 Jews were shot, machine gunned into ditches. an effort to eliminate the entire Jewish population in Kiev. So we started with Kiev and Rus, and I'll sort of end my historical treatment with Babi Yar outside of Kiev.
Olavi, thank you very, very much for that history lesson. And I think Mr. Putin uses a very select version of history to study
Yes.
things. He needs to read more. But Jacek, now over to Jacek to talk more about the Russia-Ukraine relationship, more of the military aspects, and bring things up to the present. Jacek?
I'm going to fast forward to the emergence of Ukraine as an independent state, and that's 1992. By the way, following referendum of independence, so Ukrainian people voted to secede from the Soviet Union and become an independent country. They vote overwhelmingly for that. The only part of Ukraine that doesn't vote overwhelmingly, but still supports the secession from the Soviet Union in majority is Crimea, which, by the way, you might have noticed at the previous map, Crimea was a gift given to Ukraine by Khrushchev. It was never historically part of Ukraine, and it's mostly inhabited by Russians and Russian-speaking population. So Ukraine had this curse, so to speak, or a problem, territorial problem, with Crimea being part of modern Ukraine as it emerges in 1992. Obviously, a huge country comes into independence with gigantic hopes for prosperity and freedom. And like in most of post-communist world, certainly former Soviet Union, those hopes are disappointed to a large extent. What emerges is a large country, post-communist country, a country that features in the eastern part lots of post-Soviet style heavy industry based in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv oblasti or provinces, and then much poorer western part of Ukraine, which, by the way, is much more nationalistic Ukrainian speaking, and so on and so forth. And that country kind of uneasily exists through different permutations in 1990s and 2000s. Perhaps the most important thing to know about this newly independent Ukraine is its division into Western Eastern part. And as I already mentioned, the differences between Western and Eastern Ukraine are very clear. Eastern Ukraine is clearly Russian-speaking, much more inclined to be oriented towards Russia. And the Eastern Ukraine's heavy industry depends on cooperation with Russia, linkages to Russia. Western Ukraine is agricultural, mostly poorer. It's nationalistic Ukrainian. By the way, what I describe is extremes. Most Ukrainian are neither Western Ukrainian nor Eastern Ukrainian. They live in between. They variously speak Russian and Ukrainian and define their identities in that fluid sense. That creates a very interesting and pluralistic political environment. So, by the way, as you can see, Ukrainian presidential elections swing widely between vaguely pro-Russian Eastern Ukraine and vaguely pro-Western Western Ukraine. In 2010, for instance, the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, wins the elections, from what we understand, free elections, so free and fair elections, and he rules Ukraine until 2014. What happens in 2014, you perhaps know, as the result of a political scandal and controversy, and then the movement from below against Yanukovych is overthrown and flees Russia specifically, and what replaces him is a much more pro-Western Ukrainian administration. And I'm going to fast forward really quickly. Putin's reaction, by the way, a part of much broader reaction of what he perceives to be a Russian Western aggression, is takeover of Donbass, Luhansk, and annexation and takeover of Crimean Peninsula. So that sets the stage for today's standoff between Ukraine and Russia, by the way, and the West. And one episode in that standoff is obviously this ambiguous presidency of President Trump, where essentially nothing happens with respect to the status quo. The frozen conflict continues, leading into concentration of troops, Russian troops in 2022, and what potentially is already started as a war that comes with Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, in that war, by the way, that has cyber elements. This is just one example. This is a Russian covert operation. The message that Ukrainians are getting on the internet is actually in Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And the message pretends to be a message from Polish nationalists who are claiming to take over Ukraine essentially as a revenge for crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists on Poles. And again, from what we understand, that's a Russian false flag operation. But the current president of Ukraine is Volodymyr Zelensky. You can see him in the middle. He's a former actor, but a fairly wealthy individual. The notion is that behind him is Ihor Kolomoisky, who is one of Ukrainian oligarchs, considered to be the power behind Zelensky. And in this respect, the pro-Russian oligarch Viktor Medvedchuk, that represents kind of this traditional pro-Russian wing of Ukrainian political spectrum, recently has been placed in house arrest, and his TV network has been stripped from him. So what sense do you make of it? When Putin took over Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk seceded from Ukraine, a decisive percentage of Russian voters were taken over by Russia or seceded from Ukraine. So Ukraine is no longer a country with a rough balance between pro-Russian and anti-Russian forces. Putin's aggression put Ukraine much more firmly in the pro-Western direction. It's interesting to look at the first round of 2019 Ukrainian presidential elections. And you can see that Petro Poroshenko was the favored candidate of westernmost nationalistic Ukraine. Yuri Boyko and Zelensky in this respect was the moderate candidate of the middle, and Zelensky eventually won overwhelmingly, gaining votes of most Ukrainian. Zelensky is a Russian-speaking actor who made half of his career in Russia, who is against oppression of Russian language and culture in Ukraine. He represents a moderate force. And this president is to be overthrown, and his Ukraine is to be destroyed by Russian aggression. And this is where Putin stands essentially. So my point is the following. Putin suffered a political catastrophe in 2014. Ukraine slipped from his control and became a Western country. Here's reinforcing this failure with talk of aggression and military conquest of Ukraine. There's no way he can succeed. So his measures are a crime against humanity. Number one, because it's a risk of a gigantic conflict, but number two, represents political machination of a loser who is bound to lose this confrontation, regardless of military outcomes of the conflict. And I'm going to stop at this point.
Jacek, thank you very much. Let me just echo something that Jacek said, which is Putin has talked about how this is about Ukraine should not be allowed to enter NATO, but it's, as we've seen, it's much larger than that. He really wants Ukraine obviously back under Russian control. And the great irony, as Jacek points out, is there's much, as a result of Russian actions, there is more support among Ukrainians for NATO membership than there ever was. It wasn't really that high before 2014. So from a US foreign policy perspective, I think it's incumbent upon the US administration to not only make sure that that NATO, because Putin is seeking more broadly to weaken NATO or see if he can find splits within NATO. The big challenge is to maintain that unity and even a stronger NATO over time by keeping this coalition that's been built together. That brings us logically to the focus on Europe, which is a huge focus of this crisis, both through sanctions and what Mr. Putin would like to do. For that, let's turn to Michael now to bring into this the European perspective. Michael?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make 3 points here in my initial comments, and I'll go over these pretty quickly because I want to allow plenty of time for discussion. But the first point I want to make concerns sanctions, and that is that Europe, and by Europe, I'm referring here primarily to the European Union, but of course also the UK. Europe, to this point, has been pretty united when it comes to sanctions to impose on Russia in response to the sending of Russian troops into the Donbass, but also in the event of a further invasion of Ukraine. And I mean united both among the European countries themselves and also with the United States. And this, this is not necessarily surprising, but I think it's very remarkable accomplishment given the well-known divisions within Europe on how to deal with Russia, right? Long-standing divisions among European countries between relatively pro-Russian countries who were sympathetic for cultural, historical, economic reasons to those who are very hawkish on Russia, like the Baltics and Poland, Romania, to those who just want to have a good business relationship with Russia and view them as a valuable trading partner. So there's really substantial divisions, and to this point, these have been overcome, and Europe has maintained a pretty united stance. Now, how long that will last, that's the big question, and certainly you can see a scenario whereby this European unity begins to break down, and this causes all kinds of problems for the transatlantic relationship as well. So that's the first point. The second is that Europe is very much affected by the crisis in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine obviously itself is going to be bear the primary burden of Russian military actions, but Europe is also very much affected by what is happening and may happen there. Obviously, European security is much more directly threatened than, say, the United States by the conflict in Ukraine, especially those European countries that are on the eastern edge of NATO. Economically, Europe is going to be much more affected by the fallout from this crisis. Europe depends on Russian gas for over 40% of its needs. Europe's trade with Russia is 10 times more than the US trade with Russia. So any economic fallout, including from sanctions, is going to be borne much more disproportionately by Europe. And of course, within European countries, there's different degrees of exposure to Russia when it comes to energy, when it comes to trade and so forth. And then the final way in which Europe will be dramatically affected, maybe not the final, but the other key way is the impact of the outflow of refugees from Ukraine. If full-scale warfare breaks out, this could be in the realm of hundreds of thousands of refugees pouring into Poland and other European countries. So Europe is going to be disproportionately affected by this as well. And so it's not surprising, because of the impact on Europe, that Europe has played a mediatory role in the run-up to this crisis. We had the visits to Moscow of French President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, the UK and Italian foreign ministers, and so forth. So they were very much on the front lines trying to reach some kind of agreement to stop the conflict from happening, but doesn't appear to be successful. Then the final point I want to make about Europe when it comes to the Ukraine crisis concerns the outcome, the eventual outcome of all of this, assuming at some point we have a peace deal, the fighting stops. What's the long-term outlook here? As far as the West's relationship with Russia, 3 key possible scenarios that I can see. One would be, rollback, right, in which the U.S. and the West tries to roll back Russia's increased presence in its former Soviet space. Another scenario would be containment, return to kind of Cold War efforts to contain and limit Russian expansion with all of the tensions and potential for conflict that entails. And then the final alternative would be some type of accommodation with Russia that takes into consideration their security interests and views. The rollback option, I don't think is going to happen. That's too confrontational. But when it comes to the other two choices, containment and accommodation, the Europeans, given their geographical location, given their interests, are probably going to be much more predisposed to some type of accommodation agreement with Russia. Now, accommodation, that can be Helsinki, that can be Yalta, right? That can be a sphere of influence kind of deal, another renewal of the Concert of Europe of the 19th century, or it can be an attempt to forge another Helsinki type shared security agreement. European views on this are going to be different among different countries, but there's probably a lot more sympathy in Europe for the Helsinki option there when it comes to a long-term deal to accommodate Russian security interests along with those of Europe and the United States. So I'll stop there and hopefully we have time for lots of questions and discussion.
Yeah, Michael, thanks very much. And a friend of mine at Rand Corporation has been worked on a recent report about this refugee issue. And apparently there are estimates that there could be between 1 and 5 million refugees, depending on how broad the conflict is. And 1.5 million Ukrainians were displaced in the 2014 fighting, many of whom, hundreds of thousands, went to Poland. Anyway, Michael, thank you very, very much. And now let me turn it over to Jim to manage the Q's and A's. Jim?
Hey, great job, everybody. Thank you. What I like about this is, yes, we're able to try to stay current on the different channels that we might watch. But in particular, this has focused our attention on some of the history. How did we get here? And the geography involved, as well as a little bit of the culture, and then expectations is how we move forward. Now, I've got some questions here, and the first one comes from Fred. And it's, should President Biden reverse his domestic energy policy and allow the US to become an exporter of energy? Should the US destroy the ruble? And could we, if that were an inclination of the president? How do I pass that? Who best to handle that one, Larry?
I'm happy to make a couple of comments. There's some members of Congress that are actually advocating on the energy question about flooding markets or things like that, that they want more of our energy that is being exported to be kept at home in order to keep the domestic price from rising too much. But I think, I know it may be easier said than done, but I think it's better if we remain that very strong player in international markets. We can help out with what will be increases elsewhere, but we can't do it on our own. And when you look at gas supplies, for example, these are most of the supplies are managed through long-term contracts. So it's not that flexible. There isn't that much flexibility to shift from one customer to another. You saw that the United States approached Qatar and said, Qatar, can you please help the Europeans? So there may be things to do on that score, and I think there are, but you can't just wholesale switch all of the roles, neither to stop exporting or to vastly increase production and try to flood markets. I don't think the ruble destruction angle is a possible one. As a matter of fact, I think the Russians have over the years made themselves less vulnerable to the dollar. They used to do more transactions in dollars, hold more reserves in dollars, and that has steadily been cut down, I think, very much almost in preparation for something like this, when Russia would become the object of more sanctions and become vulnerable. So limit the vulnerability by cutting back your transactions in dollars. And so it's more in rubles, but I don't think that the United States has the ability to really damage the ruble as such. But it will over time, not just in the United States, because the Europeans put on the same sanctions yesterday and today to limit Russian access to borrowing abroad and to make it more expensive, excuse me.
So a related question comes in from George, and that is the Reagan administration effectively bankrupted the USSR economically and militarily. Are conditions in Russia currently such that it could happen again with or without EU participation?
I can take a crack at that.
Go ahead.
Okay.
As Larry said, I think that the Russians have done a good job since the Crimea sanctions were imposed. A good job insulating themselves, building up huge sovereign reserves, I think in the realm of $600 billion or so, and developing Russian industries to substitute for ones that they would get imports for. So I think there's much less realm there, but still the sanctions could hurt, but the kinds of sanctions that are going to be necessary to really hurt Russia are going to require cooperation from all of our allies, and that includes not just the Europeans. They obviously are much more economically connected to Russia, but also our Asian partners. When it comes to things like technology exports, other allies are going to have to be supportive of this for it to really work. The potential's there, depending on how far the sanctions go. I mean, they could be financially hugely destructive. They're denying Russia technologies that they need to modernize their economy and to develop their military weaponry. And this could all be very devastating if allowed to run for several years. I mean, in the short term, probably not so, but it may take 2 or 3 years for them to really have an impact. But the U.S. can't do it alone. We can't do it unilaterally. We need the cooperation of our allies.
I think Michael is 100% correct on all of that. In the short term, the Russians benefit because the price of oil and gas goes up, okay? And they're still purveyors, as long as they keep supplying. If they become an unreliable supplier, it hurts them too for the long run. And Michael makes the most important point. People should not think of sanctions. You do one thing and you stop an action. You know, the next week they go. Now, if you didn't have views like Mr. Putin, which is he's living to bring back Ukraine into the fold, then it might be a more rational actor you might be dealing with. The other thing is he faces no accountability domestically, really. So there aren't people saying I'm paying too much at the pump. I don't like the fact that the Russian economy is lagging behind the United States and China and Europe, and it has no dynamism and all of that. They don't complain about that. So he has that great luxury. But the reality of it is, as Michael says, over time, you are absolutely weakening the Russian economy. In the shorter term, they still get to benefit like most of these petroleum resource dominated countries. They benefit from that. But those countries are planning in some ways more for their future, or trying to, than Russia is, you know, future with a lower energy price as you go to renewables. And Russia is perhaps preparing less for that.
Let me, pardon me, go to a question asked by Herb. And Herb asks, if we stop here with our sanctions and Putin stops here without further invasion, it seems we have only part of our sanctions, only part of our penalties in place. Is this much of a punishment to Putin as we know it? And Germany gave up their pipeline, which is a hard hit for them. Should we be holding back like this? Let me ask Michael this one, please.
Yeah, I'll just start with the Germany and the pipeline issue. Germany, they did suspend basically the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. What they did is they withdrew the certification. The German government was required to certify that the pipeline didn't pose a security risk, basically a security and supply risk. And then back in October, they certified that it did not, and allowed the process of opening the pipeline, beginning this operation to go forward. It's still facing other regulatory decisions that it hasn't cleared those hurdles yet. But what the German government did today was to basically withdraw that certification. But they didn't terminally kill the project. They simply have put it on ice, suspended it. So it's possible in the future they could recertify it and it could go forward. So, and I can't remember the partial sanctions. Well, I think a lot of that is strategic. They're withholding the heaviest sanctions as a deterrent to further Russian action. And the thinking being, if you hit them with the harshest sanctions right now, then you've basically exhausted your opportunities, your potential, and you have nothing left. So you've kind of you're keeping your powder dry, so to speak, by not imposing the heaviest sanctions right now. The question is, what is Putin just going to stop with the partial invasion of the Donbass, or is he going to go further? And I think most people think it's probably likely he goes further, in which case heavier sanctions are going to be required.
Yeah. All right, thank you. And the next question comes from Chip. And Olavi, given your national background, and that is you're originally born in Estonia, I'd like to ask this question. Would cyber attacks, this comes from Chip, would cyber attacks be more successful than sanctions as a deterrent or punishment of Russia for its aggression?
Okay, I think in part Chip is asking that question because Estonia experienced the first major cyber attack in 2007, and it shut down for a good part of a day all banking and government establishment institutions. The reverse. Now, NATO, of course, has a center for excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, as a result, and we have experts working on it, presumably to defensive, largely looking at this from a defensive point of view, how to repel such attacks in the future. I don't really know if how much effort is going into a possibility of going on the offensive. And I have not read too much about this, of infiltrating Russian computers and cyberware. And so as a result, right, it is something that I think NATO should prepare to do if it is not doing that. But I confess I have not run across any articles or any information on that. But it's a good question, and it's a good something that we should be doing.
Does any one of our other panelists, Michael or Larry or Jacek, do you have any thoughts or opinions on that? And I just toss that out. If the answer is no, if there's silence, then I'll go on to the next one. I
would just say that there's kind of an asymmetry here between cyber war and sanctions. When it comes to economic sanctions, the West, being much more prosperous, economically developed than Russia, we can impose a much heavier burden on Russia than they can impose on us through counter sanctions, right? I mean, Russia can reply with their own economic sanctions, but it's not going to have that big of an impact, perhaps, on the West, short of maybe cutting off all energy exports to Europe, say, but that would hurt Russia equally, if not more so. When it comes to cyber, however, I mean, there's more of a equality of capabilities, and so if we were more aggressive with cyber attacks against Russia, then they would respond likely and probably be able to hit us just as hard as we can hit them. So that's, I think, the main difference.
Can I just say that, and it's not because Olavi's on this call, that I wish that the rest of Europe would learn lessons from this about its own vulnerabilities, the way Estonia learned about its vulnerabilities after the cyber attacks from Russia, because I didn't think that they were going. I wasn't very optimistic about lessening European dependence, energy and dependence on Russia after 2014 in Crimea. And unfortunately, I think I was proven correct. But I hope this time that the lesson on energy is taken more to heart and actually leads to more change this time.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask one question at the end, and I'd like each of you to comment on it, which will take us over a little bit, but if you're okay with that, so am I. And that has to do, if I understood, Larry, what you commented about the enlargement of NATO being a possibility. That has its pluses and minuses.
No,
at least as I see that. Can I go to you first, and then I'd like to go to each one of the other panelists with their thoughts about that?
No, actually, I didn't. Thanks for saying, for raising the issue, because I did not say that. What I actually said was NATO needed to be strengthened over time. I said NATO strengthening is key, not NATO enlargement. So I'm not arguing for NATO enlargement. I'm not at this point. I think it's right to be protective of the right of a country to seek NATO membership. And Mr. Putin, I think, is wrong in the lesson that he took from the Gorbachev-Bush era of that discussion, because we never promised that there would not be 1 inch of enlargement. That was not the case. But nor am I someone who thinks that somehow because we enlarged NATO, that provoked the Russians needlessly. No, these countries had that desire. And again, so I'm not arguing for further NATO enlargement. It's up to the countries. But as we pointed out earlier, in part, I mean, what Mr. Putin is doing is creating more support in some countries, and including it, certainly in Ukraine it did, for going into NATO. I think it was a minority. I heard maybe 30% before of Ukrainians supported NATO, maybe before Crimea in 2004, and then 70% since, or up to 70%. So I think it's counterproductive from his point of view, but I'm not arguing forward. It's just we shouldn't just take away anybody's right, first of all, to be sovereign, and secondly, to choose its alliances, or choose to be neutral if they like.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I stand corrected. But I would like to go to Jacek and get your thought, because you spent a lot of time writing and reading and teaching about the defense of Europe. Anyway, in particular, I referenced your book on the defense of Eastern Europe. Do you have thought on this, of the enlargement of NATO?
If the question is NATO membership for Ukraine, it's clearly not in the cards. But there were questions raised about NATO membership for Finland and Sweden. So up until recently, those were countries that were attached to the neutrality. And from what I understand, membership in NATO was not seriously considered by domestic elite as an option for those countries. So the recent events mightily strengthen the case inside of Sweden and Finland to join NATO. And I wouldn't be in principle opposed to it. Those are militarily powerful countries compared to stereotypes of peaceful Scandinavians. Sweden and Finland have strong military establishments, and they would be a net addition to NATO potential and provide the potential deterrence against Russia on the northern flank. So I'm actually for Swedish and Finnish NATO and enlargement of NATO in this respect, if those countries so desire and meet the membership criteria. Obviously, and I think it was already said that one result of Russian aggression was strengthening of NATO and strengthening of NATO military potential in Eastern Europe. And by the way, mostly because of arming efforts of countries like Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics, that today are much more militarily prepared to deter Russian aggression. And we are not talking about symbolic forces. We are talking about serious militarization and serious level of military spending of those countries that provide Russia with a serious conventional military deterrent. Now, obviously, the Air Force and the nuclear forces at strategic level, and that's the United States. But if Russia wants to fight a purely conventional war against Poland, the Baltic countries, NATO allies, there's no easy scenario for Russian conquest in this respect. And by the way, Russia is weaker than it appears.
Okay. Thank you. And Olavi, did you have a thought on that?
Well, I would say, and I participated in writing one of the articles in the book which Jacek co-edited and wrote a number of articles for. Much still depends on European countries coming up, and by European countries, we're talking about France and Germany in particular, if one looks at Northern Europe, and Britain, being prepared as if the crisis develops, for example, in the Baltic area, being prepared to move forces into the area. I think, yes, much has occurred and much is occurring in the defense expenditure even in these small Baltic states. For example, to give an example, in the Zapad exercises, which the Russian army conducts in the West, the Baltic Sea Fleet planned amphibian landings, and as a result of the obvious examples of practicing amphibious landings, Sweden, which had recently actually taken all of its military out of Gotland, its major island, moved military back, and Estonia, with its numerous islands in the Baltic Sea, has decided in the next 5 years to spend all extra budgeted money on the defense of the islands by purchasing mines and looking at land-to-sea missiles, which are going to be put in place to prevent that from happening and shut down that possibility of a Baltic Sea Fleet, Russian Baltic Sea Fleet landing in any of the islands, Estonian islands. And of course, the Finns have also looked at that possible scenario also. So in the last 5-6 years, defense has increased, and these countries are in a better situation than before. Finland and Sweden are participating in NATO exercises in the Baltic.
Very interesting. Thank you. So what I'd like to do with, and we are over, but I'd like to go in reverse and ask if each of you has any last minute thoughts on that you'd like to toss out, maybe that wasn't in your area when the questions came, but you'd like to throw out. You need not say anything if you say, no, I've said it all and I would understand, but I'd like to start in reverse order and start with Michael, please.
I just would say that this is a very dangerous situation in Ukraine. And we can't overlook the possibility that it could expand into a wider war involving not just Ukraine, but also NATO and the rest of Europe. I mean, there's the possibility if the Russian attack, if it broadens into a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and then Russia has to deal with a very bloody insurgency, then that insurgency is probably going to be supported by neighboring European countries that provide safe havens and support of different kinds, and driven to desperation by the inability to easily conquer Ukraine, this might drive Putin perhaps to think about threatening Poland, Baltic states, Romania, whoever's providing these safe havens. It's a scenario whereby the situation expands beyond just Ukraine is conceivable. And so I don't think we think enough about that. In the First World War, we sleptwalked into war one step by after another, and the situation here is also, I think, worrisome in terms of that something similar could happen. I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. And Jacek, any last thoughts?
I agree with Michael. Being Polish, the whole thing reminds me so much of 1939 and this predictable run up to war, which was a long kind of push towards it. And in 1939, 38 especially, German military wanted to overthrow Hitler, knowing that he will lose. And the whole thing didn't make sense because he was bound to lose. By the way, the Munich conference saved Hitler in this respect from being overthrown in a military coup. Right. And its domestic situation was much better in 1939. But still, the immediate reaction of the world was, oh my God, he's going to lose. And he did. So the prediction was right. Now, what happened in the meantime is a matter of history. And this is where Michael's point is might be tragically so on point. Mm-hmm. I foresee no scenario whereby Putin wins politically. There's no victory for him in this venture. Nevertheless, it can happen with tragic consequences for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Olavi.
Well, as a historian, I look upon Putin's outlook. I would place him late 19th century Russian imperial thinking, right? And he's very critical of Lenin. And he's very critical of, and he blames Lenin for having created Ukraine in that 1922 treaty that which established the Soviet Union, which we talked about. So he's very critical of Lenin, of opening a kind of a Pandora's box, and it's very unfortunate. I mean, following the demise of the Soviet Union, one option could have been of rethinking Russian identity and looking at this in a broader context. We talked about the common roots of Ukrainian and Russian and Belarusian culture, but there are these differences of taking that into account and looking at something new. But what I see in Putin is someone who's just fallen back into a kind of very kind of set traditional mold of sort of late 19th century imperial type of thinking. It's very unfortunate for Russia.
With a lot more power too.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And Larry, please.
I mentioned that we had to demonstrate that we're in this for the long haul. That's not easy for U.S. administrations who are subject to all the political situations and elections. But I think in this case, it has to be done. The diplomacy is going to be intensive with our European and other allies, more or less on a permanent basis, because I think the Russian pressure on Ukraine, however far this invasion goes, even if it doesn't go beyond the Donbass, for example, but it very well might, there's going to be continuous Russian pressure on Ukraine. And if you care, and we need to care and protect the principle of sovereignty, then you have to be in this, and we have to be in this for the long haul and supporting it. That also means that Congress has to be in it for the long haul, that it shouldn't be used as a political issue, I hope, and that we're in support of taking principled stances in this case. And the last thing is, again, this is another lesson, hopefully learn better this time, of the dangers of energy dependence on a country, particularly if that country is not a reliable supplier and likes to use energy as a weapon.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Great point to end with.
Can I give a final comment?
Certainly.
Finish up what Larry was trying to say, I think. If Larry is right, then the critical front in that war is United States domestic politics and US public opinion and the fate of elections and presidency in the United States. And if the country becomes divided and United States and slips back into isolationism, I can imagine Putin's victory, actually. And I think it's a big takeaway of this. Would you agree with me, Larry?
I think, I said at the outset that there are principles that I think need to be supported in U.S. Foreign policy. And it doesn't matter if you're supporting an American first position or not. There are certain fundamental principles that need to be supported for general international peace and security. And we have the United States has a major role and will continue to have a major role in playing it. And I think others want us to play it.
Great. Well, thank you. This will conclude our program. And thank you, Ambassador Silverman, Professors Arens, Baun, and Lubecki. There's much that we've learned from you tonight on this current crisis, how it developed, what Putin wants, the potential impacts to Europe and the United States. And a major point is, as each of you has said, this is not going to be an easy problem to solve. We have got to stay informed. You've helped us very much with that tonight. And to our viewers looking ahead, our next program will be in person at the Skidaway Island Community Church, Liston Hall, our usual location, at 7:30 p.m. on March 10th, as you can see on the slide. Our program will feature the Consul General of India, Swati Kulkarni, speaking on India's democracy and its rise in the world. And thank you again, Ambassador Silverman and Professors Arens, Baun, Lubecki, for a timely and interesting discussion. Thank you to our members, to our sponsor, Kreitz Auto Group, and to our members. And with that, I wish each of you a good night. We'll see you on March 10th. Thank you again.